They say that a mark of an educated mind is the ability to entertain opposing opinions. That is the ability to keep an open mind to appreciate the truth of both sides. So let me toss this out. Let's try this on for size. The Apostle Paul said that we are all sinners and have fallen short of the glory of God, but we are justified by God's grace as a gift. He said that our salvation is free. So Christians through the ages have proclaimed that we are saved by grace. But our salvation, that's our salvation is dependent on, not on what we have done, but on what Christ has done for us. Why then is this gospel? What is this gospel talking about today? Because the word gospel means good news. It means that salvation is free. We don't earn our way into heaven. And that's good news, because most of us couldn't even work our way into the Oval Office, even as a guest, much less as the president. So how do we work our way into heaven? Well, that's impossible. But Paul assures us that it isn't our good behavior that opens the door to heaven, but God's grace. And that's actually the good news. But that's just one side of the picture. The other side. Jesus tells a story about a rich man who went on a journey. Before departing, he divided his property among his 3 servants. The amount of money that he left with the servants was actually very large. For modern world, in our world today, let's just say that one of the servants was left about $5 million. The other one was left about $2 million. And the third one was left about $3 million. While the master was gone, the $5 million servant invested his money and made more money. In fact, he actually doubled his money, as with the $2 million servant too. But the $1 million servant was afraid. So he buried his money into the ground for safekeeping. When the master returned, the $5 million servant gave him back $5 million plus $5 more million. And then, as we heard, the master replied, "Well done, good and trusted servant. You have been trustworthy in many things, so I'll put you in charge of many things." And he entered into the joy of the master. The $2 million servant did the same thing. He brought back $2 million and doubled it. And the servant gave praise to him as well. But as we saw with the $1 million servant, he was afraid to do anything with the money. So he hid it. He buried it into the ground. So when the master returned, he said, "Here's your $1 million back." But as we see, the master rebuked what the servant had done. And he had him thrown out into the darkness. Because we see the servant failed to use the money as the master had entrusted him to do. Christians through the ages have interpreted this parable to mean that God will hold us accountable for the ways that we use the gifts that he's given. These gifts include all sorts of things: money, time, and talent being the big 3. In other words, our salvation depends, at least in part, on the way that we use God's gifts. And how we use God's gifts to serve others. So here's the other side of the story. The first side was that God gives us salvation free. The second side is that God will hold us accountable for our actions. So we need to use what God has given to us, money, time, talents, and other things, responsibly. Our salvation depends on it. At least that's the impression that Jesus uses in this parable today. So is it right? Is Paul right? Is Jesus right? Or do Each represent an extreme position. But the truth is somewhere in the middle. Or maybe they're both right. I don't know about you, but I'm reluctant to say that the Apostle Paul was wrong. And I'm very reluctant to say that Jesus was wrong. So I want to say that they were both right. But how can that be? It might help to note that while God is generous, well, he's very, very generous to each and every one of us, he isn't a sucker. He wants us to give out and to give back, but to those in need. But we can't earn what we are given. But we want our loyalty to be returned to him. Giving God our loyalty means trying to live as he wants us to live. That means, at least in part, using the gifts that he has given to us. In the parable of the talents, the master showed great trust by leaving so much money in the care of his three servants. The first servant honored that trust by using the master's money wisely. Likewise, the second servant did the same thing. These two servants respected the master. They knew what he wanted, and they did their best to give it to him. And then we have the third servant. Though he acted quite differently, he acted differently because he felt differently towards the master. He didn't respect the master. He didn't love the master. He actually feared the master, as we read. He thought the master was a hard man, even though the master had been generous to all three. This third servant didn't care what the master wanted, so he didn't try to do what the master wanted him to do. The third servant cared only about himself, his own life. So instead of using the master's money wisely, he buried it. He hoped to avoid the responsibility by sitting on the money, keeping it safe. But it didn't work. The master left the money to be used. He expected the servants to do something, to make the world a little bit better, to make someone happy, to put the money to work. Jesus didn't just say what would have happened if the man had tried and failed. If he had done his best, had he tried to use the money in a way to earn more on it. But I'm confident in the matter who God represented would have been okay with him. God is able to see our hearts. God really cares about what is in our hearts, what is in our hands. The third servant had really tried to do something right. The master would have realized it and respected that. He would have forgiven the servant for hiding his talents into the ground. But to do nothing, that was not acceptable. The master would have recommended that the servant had done something with the talents that he had given him. I believe that he would have supported him, even if he had lost the money. But he had no patience with the servant who didn't even want to go to bat for him. While working on this sermon, I came across the story I would like to share with you. It comes from a book entitled Let Live by Curtis Mitchell. Mitchell tells the story of Miss Jones, an elderly spinster lady who lived in a Midwest town. When Miss Jones died, the editor of the local paper wanted to say something nice about her in the obituary column, but he had trouble coming up with anything. Miss Jones had never caused any trouble, but it seems she had done not much good either. The editor learned that the man who sold tombstones was having the same problem. What could she be put on her tombstone other than Miss Jones's name and the date of her birth and her death? The editor went back to the office and signed the project to a sports writer. The sports writer did a little research, but he couldn't find much that Miss Jones had ever done. Finally, he took a little verse that summarized Miss Jones to a T. And so I'm told, if you were to visit the graveyard where Miss Jones is buried, you would read this on her tombstone. Here lies the bones of Nancy Jones. For her life had no terror. She lived a life as an old maid, and she died as an old maid. No hits, no runs, no errors. The parable of the talents teach us that God doesn't have much patience with no hits, no runs, and no errors kind of life. He gives us something, money, talent, time, or the things that we have that God has given to us. He wants us to use these gifts to glorify Him. He wants us to use these gifts to make a world a better place. He wants us to use these gifts to help our neighbors. The parable of the 12 of the talents is found in the middle of the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. In the next part of the chapter, which we will be considering the next week, Jesus makes it clear that He wants us to use our time, money, and talent to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to help the sick, to visit the prisoner. Jesus paints a very rosy picture of our future if we do these things. He paints a very bleak picture of our future if we don't. Let me close by asking 3 questions. You wouldn't have to answer. You don't have to answer me. You don't have to wave your hand in the air. Just listen to the 3 questions and think about the answers during the next week. The first question is, what did God give you? Money, perhaps. You most likely aren't rich, but you have money, time. As nearly as I can tell, we all have the same amount of time, 168 hours a week. Some of us will give more of our weeks and years than others. But each of us will have the same amount of time each week. Or talent. Some of us can sing, some of us can cook. Some of us can chop wood, and other of us can push paper. Some of us fix faucets, while others heal hearts. Some of us lead, and some of us can follow. But God gave all of us something which we can use to honor Him. Something that which we can make this world a better place. So the first question is, what did God give to you? The second is, what are you doing with these gifts? What are you doing to honor God? What are you doing to help other people? The third question is, what are you bringing? Or what should you be bringing? I can't answer these questions for you. This is between you and God. But it's important questions that we need to ask. What can we do? What can we be doing? What should we be doing? I want you to think about these questions. So let me review these questions one more time. First, what has God given you? Second, what are you doing with them? Third, what can you be doing in them? And what should you be doing with them? Like I said, I can't answer these questions for you. But it's important that we ask these questions because it relates back to our relationship with God and about your love for God. And more importantly, about your Christian discipleship. These questions have the potential to point your life to a new direction, so that you become a blessing to others, and so that you can truly experience God blessing yourself. As we continue to move through this time of COVID, these questions are even more relevant than they would be in a normal year. So I ask you to take the time and think about the talents that God has given to you. And how are we using them to make this world a better place? It's so important. These questions are so important in the time that we are living right now. So take some time during this week to think about it. And in a way, it may change your life. You may see talents that you have that you didn't know you had before. Please use these talents to continue to further God's kingdom in the world that we live in today. And may we do that and may we do this not for our glory, but for the glory of God. Amen.